Well, hello, everyone. We are lighting the candle, A World That Works. I'm Bill Carell, and I have with me today two very good friends, Ken Caputo and Jan Jeremias. And we've been engaged in a pretty interesting conversation, which we either will continue at some point or won't. But the point today is that we're here to see if we can generate a little bit of empowerment. And empowerment is not something you find, it's something that you create at a moment's notice in place of whatever else is there. My definition. How you like that? So the point is that as we go through all of these wonderful conversations, we have kind of a litmus test as to whether or not you, the listener, are getting any value out of it. And that's because we notice in our own bodies and our own self that there's some kind of a shift, some kind of a feeling of a difference being made. And we usually access these conversations with a jumping on point, and it has to do with linguistics. It has to do with picking a word or two and comparing and contrasting and distinguish what they mean for us. And then all of the ancillary and tertiary and whatever the next area is in terms of other thoughts that come to mind in terms of what we all say. So in a really great conversation, and I would say I would qualify the last week's conversation as a great conversation. It's a little bit like popcorn, just things firing and bursting, forth here and there. So I had a thought today for our leaping on, and again, it's almost like we're going to jump on the carousel while it's going full blast here, because that's what life seems to be looking like for a lot of people. But there's this notion, and it's a really very interesting and abstract notion, that there's this thing called the past, and there's this thing called the future. And it's kind of an interesting place to begin, both with a dictionary definition and also maybe just some opening thoughts from you all. And while you're doing that, I'll look up some dictionary definitions. But let me hand the ball over to Ken. And Ken, how are you doing today? And what are your thoughts?
I'm doing spectacular. And so my thoughts on the idea of past and future, is that is that what I'm
Sure.
commenting on? Yeah.
Yes, if you want, or something else.
Oh, well, I think they're very necessary. From while also having a appropriate ratio so that they serve as guides for the spiral of your life. So like it's, we talk a lot in the Eastern traditions about present moment awareness and mindfulness, and that's being connected to the moment that you're experiencing right now, and being open to that. And I was always told, if you spend too much time focusing on the future, it leads to anxiety. Too much time focused on the past can lead to depression. So, but if you're all present moment, how do you keep your life from just being circular? So you got to learn from your past, and then you've got to kind of prepare for the future, and then do that in a way that's balanced, so that you can, the journey becomes the home, and your present experience is what's most prevalent in your awareness, but you have that past and future kind of framing, so that you can be successful, whatever that means to you.
Interesting. Soaking in. Jan, how about you?
I love what Ken says, and I yogic philosophy is probably very much the same. And as far as being in the past and the present, you kind of take the nuggets from the past that you need, kind of leave the stuff you don't. And I think the easy as I navigate, certain things which are either past, present, or future. I was talking to my mom this morning, and I think the one thing that I said that, every time, it's not like it's profound. It was like, I was like, got to go back to gratitude. Like there was just this feeling of taking myself when I get too preoccupied with the past or I worry too much about the future. I've got to go back to the moment, and the way I anchor into the moment is being grateful for what I have, because I don't spend there. I don't. I then I'm not occupied with my head in the things I don't have, or the things I want that haven't come to fruition at the moment. And so I sit there and I'm like, okay, that's not happening as fast as I want it to happen. My plan is going faster than what it's not progressing as fast as I'd like. So I've got to go back to what I do have to keep me centered and grounded.
I like it. So I'll take a moment here and we'll basically give the dictionary definitions of these two words. Past as an adjective means gone by in time and no longer existing. The danger is now past. Or as a noun, the time or a period of time before the moment of speaking or writing. She found it hard to make ends meet in the past. Then, as a preposition, this is interesting. To or on the other further side of, like something to get beyond. So, adverb, so as to pass from one side of something to the other. And it's also used to indicate a lapse of time. And this is why I think people from other countries that speak other languages think that English is so damn difficult to learn. One word, five different types of words with five separate meanings. That's just past. Now, how about future? So, future is the time or period of time following the moment of speaking or writing, time regarded as still to come. So, all right, there's also a financial uh, meaning to it, which is an indication of something you can buy that has a future potential value greater than what it is now. So, what's interesting to me is the notion of time um, varies around the world, and it also varies by person. And simply put, whenever you or I talk about what we want that we don't now have, we're actually creating a future. And there's this interesting thing that I learned in manufacturing about these things called time fences. They're the period of time in which you can make no meaningful change to make a difference, where you're just kind of like going to have to deal with what's in front of you at the rate that it's coming. And then beyond that, there's another period of time where you can effect change. As far as the future and the past goes, there are so many different really great conversations. Both of you talked about this, like a place to exist and live. And the really interesting part of it is that when we notice that our thought is in the past, something that's occurred before that we're reliving or rehashing or trying to figure out what happened, um, or we're in that moment where we're thinking about what's to come and when things work out, like after the dog dies, when the kids graduate from college, all of that stuff later, that those time fences where something has to occur in order for you to have what you want and desire and need, right? So the really important distinction here that I heard both of you bring up is that there is this moment where you can separate your thinking, notice that your thinking is not mindful and about now and appreciating exactly where you are for everything that it is and everything that it isn't. And what's really, really remarkable about that is that most people do not have that gear. They are at the mercy of the thoughts they are currently having. And those thoughts continue to run until there's some sort of an interruption, usually external. I'm saying, okay? Whether it's true or not, is another thing. But the whole idea of having the choice of presentness, presenteeism, like right here, right now, there's no other place I'd rather be. Um, that having that gear makes things very, very powerful in the present, because I remember reading an old ancient truism that although we act like there will be a tomorrow and there was a yesterday, what we know for sure is there is a now.
An interesting practice that I've done through the years, my teachers shared many years ago, and that's really literally to follow where your mind goes, like, and label it past, past, future, future. And certain days it goes in one direction more so than the other.
Yeah.
And then certain people tend to, like, if you start to follow it over a period of time, you might notice that certain people during certain times, all of a sudden they become fully aware of how much they live in the past, and it's just like an awareness of just saying, okay, past, past, you know, I'm here now, future. So,
I like it. There's this metaphor that I got trained in, which is to view your thoughts like a big file cabinet. And the memories are those things that are still sticking around from the past, because you will notice all the things that you don't think about if I ask you to, and that you will be triggered by at some point by a word or some physical object or some person that you see that you haven't thought about for years and years and years and years. So they're in the file cabinet, and those rascals come out in the present, and that present is where we re-experience those thoughts. So we have this way as human beings of kind of creating a future file in that cabinet. This is the things that ultimately we can do. It's kind of like the whole field of possibility. What's possible from here that we would be able to do? Now, unfortunately, most human beings are going to use more bigger and better as in reference to what they know now in their past experiences, as opposed to creating this whole new let's go to Mars, kind of a wide open thing that we all know is completely impossible right now. And yet, why not play that game, right? So that takes the past out of the file drawer for the past and starts to put those things into the future, where you start making deals with yourself. Like, next year, I want my sales to be up by 10 or 15%. I was just at a meeting last week where we went around the table and I asked folks, what do you want 2023 to look like from a business standpoint? There was no one who said, I'd like to quadruple next year. Almost everybody was making deals in terms of 10 to 20% increase over this year. And I just asked them, and I said, if you get 10 to 20% increase next year, will your dreams come true? And I waited, and then finally somebody said, you know what? I really do have to throw that stick away and invent a whole new stick. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, I walk and I have this stick that I got when I was 12 years old. And that stick was as tall as I was back in those days. But that stick today comes up a little higher than my belt buckle. It occurs to me that I need a new stick to go where I'm going. I need a stick that is now the size that I am today. And that other stick has served me very well, but I'm going to put it away. And I said, I got nothing, man. That's as cool as I could think myself, I mean, ever. I mean, thank you. And so the whole notion of the past being something where we believe we understand the facts about what happened, and there's a lot of evidence for we don't. And in many cases, we have a story that got put in place of an actual memory that we've repeated over and over again, that's been embellished and had things added to, but internally we experience it as exactly that's what happened. Now, what if you could do that for the future? Remember the future as well as the past.
Sounds like just creative visualization. I mean, you do that a lot in athletics. You visualize how you will perform in advance of the actual performing of it. And I don't remember who said it. Might have been Dennis Waitley's. He was saying the mind can't differentiate between something vividly imagined and something that actually happens. And I guess they even did, there was some kind of study where they had athletes walk on a treadmill, and they'd measure the electrical responses, like the neuromuscular responses. Then they had them sit perfectly still and visualize walking, and the response was exactly the same. Like the nervous system was telling them they were walking, was responding as if they were walking, even though the muscles weren't actually engaging. So yeah,
So the neat part of that is it's a great example in a particularly finely defined area. But what if all of life is has that potential? What if all you have to do in the present is to sit down and responsibly think about what you're creating for yourself, your family, your community, your world in the future, and make decisions about that? What would life look like for you and for others?
Well, I think there would be a consciousness, like an awareness that of people's lives, and y- because how much do we act and we don't really think about what we do? You know, how many
there's,
times do we eat? How many times do we eat and really not even notice we ate?
there's a Buddhist thing my mentor used to say all the time, and it's just three words: consciousness, choice, change. And it began with becoming aware. It's like, I think every single one of us, regardless of our level of awareness, has present moment experiences. We may just not know that that's what we're having,
Hmm.
and so it's an unconscious thing that's running in the background. It's funny how there's a lot of ranting and raving about wake up, being woke, all that kind of stuff. And it's funny, like the context of that is very interesting to me, because from a Buddhist perspective, to be awakened is just to be aware and noticing, the processes going around inside and outside, and without judgment or expectation. And I think that's the challenge with the future: is how do it's great to visualize the future you want and consider manifesting that, but if you put too great an expectation on it, that's not going to work out. Like, the best athletes train a skill, and then they visualize the future of winning the game, but they don't caught up in how exactly that's going to happen, because there are too many elements they can't control, and they very well may not achieve that thing that they dreamed of. So follow your dreams can be a bunch of crap. Because number one, it may not work out that way, regardless of how much you visualize it. And number two, you, Brian Tracy used to say, be careful that when you climb up the ladder of success, you don't end up realizing it's leaning up against the wrong building, you know? so so it's like, do you give yourself space to pivot, so that you
Yeah.
don't get so caught up in that visualization and that goal and making it happen, that at some point you forget to check in and make sure it's still true for you, and it isn't time to pivot. It's, it's interesting. It's like deeper, than I think a lot of the stuff I've studied over the years anyway, they're trying to simplify it and do goal setting seminars or whatever it is, but that can be sort of limiting and actually defeating if it's not framed right, with nuance and context.
Well, I think what you do, one of the things that when you said that, Ken, is I think of attaching to whatever your vision is if you become too firmly attached to it or how you think, quote unquote, it should pan out, then that's where your downfall is
Yeah.
because that doesn't leave any room for flow or just
Yeah.
or I think about when I first started teaching yoga, I would plan every class like every class. I'd write down exactly what poses I was going to do and how I was going to transition into it and everything. And I understood why I did it. I look back because it was new and I was trying to learn it and I hadn't taught before and everything. And then I realized the first class that I taught where I did that, and not one student could have done the plan that I had created. I walked in and I thought, okay, that's just not going to work. And I ended up having to teach on the fly because I looked at the people and what they were capable and how they came in energetically on that day. And I thought to myself, okay, I've got to create from here. Like my plan isn't going to work. And I threw the plan out the window. And after that, I never really planned a class again. Like I plan, but I plan more about like philosophically theming and what I want to share as far as ideas or thoughts or things like that, and not about actual poses per se. And so, which might horrify some of the studio owners that I teach at, but it was a way for me to stay in touch with the people because otherwise I wasn't teaching for them. I was teaching for some idea I had. And so when you talk about vision, I think of a vision board, because a vision board is a really interesting thing. I've done vision boards for a really long time because you kind of put down what you want. But for me, I always kind of leave it kind of open ended. Like I don't really, I just, these are things that I'd like hypothetic, like in my life at some point, and I'm just going to go through my life and see, because I think subconsciously they're there, and seeing them kind of puts them more to the like more in your like right where it's seen. So it's kind of interesting because it's not attaching to them per se, but they are there. So you're like, oh, that's right, that came about, and I really wasn't even technically doing much like that, I thought, quote unquote, but it's there, and so it came about. It's an interesting
It's funny as you're talking about, the yoga teaching. I've seen it over and over again. It's fascinating. Like as a teacher becomes more skillful, what ends up happening is they frame the lessons differently. So there's more of a curiosity level. So you're able to go in now and basically say, won't it be interesting to see how the value of yoga expresses itself today? And you've developed this trust in your own skill set to be able to kind of serve as a guide. And, I mean, when you're a guide, sometimes it's raining, sometimes people aren't that engaged, and but you can still, you're so familiar with being a competent guide that, you can just navigate, and your only expectation is we're going to have an experience together today. So, and I would see that with new teachers. They come in with the plan, and most of the time they end up disappointed because
well,
they've set that expectation that just isn't gonna, reality isn't gonna work that way, especially when you're working with kids. Forget it. They'll humble you really quick.
well, I had that. I remember one of the first experiences where I remember, when I did my teacher training, we had to do practice classes. And I remember planning out my class and everything. And I left and I was so disappointed because it didn't exactly go how I wanted it to go, quote unquote. And everybody walked up to me and said, wow, that was awesome. And I remember thinking to myself, and there I was disappointed because I
Yeah.
had an idea in my head of how I wanted it to pan out. And it wasn't anything like that in my head anyway, even though everybody else just loved it. And then what's interesting is the days sometimes where I feel off, and then people will come in and say, "Oh my gosh, that was such an amazing class." And you feel yourself like, "Okay, thanks,"
Yep.
like you're not feeling totally on. And the days where I think it's an amazing class, and then people won't say anything.
Yeah,
And
yeah, they're just kind of like, meh.
okay, it's all good, but it is an interesting practice.
Yeah.
So the next level on the file cabinet is you put things in the file cabinet and then you forget they're there. And but they're there. I mean, they absolutely are there. And as you're going through life, everybody has an unwritten set of rules that they've already determined by their past experiences that they'll live by. Those are the attachments. They're there all the time and everywhere. And you cannot make them go away intellectually. You can only notice what they are, like dashboard lights. So, for instance, when you're talking about doing an agenda for a class and it didn't go the way you wanted it to go, you have a reaction to that called disappointment. Well, that disappointment actually is a demonstration of two things. One, your commitment to deliver something, okay, which you felt would be of value to the people that were participating. And then number two, probably undistinguished from your commitment, is the attachment to an outcome. That attachment to the outcome is what usually gets people in gear to get going somewhere, or stops them right where they are with, completely being froze. So the neat part of attachment is, your thoughts don't ever come up and say, I'm an attachment. You don't have to do anything that I'm talking about. Usually you get a gut level, experiential reaction to something. And that's the dashboard lights. It doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't even mean anything that it doesn't mean anything. It is basically an opportunity for you to see, as Sting used to say, the landmines that you've laid and forgotten about. And when you come across one of those, you now have a choice to proceed or make a decision to go back and retreat to something that's more comfortable, or do something completely new. So the neat part about the past is that it's all pervasive and undistinguished, and it's always there, for all human beings. When you know that it's there and you have a reaction, then there's this really cool choice that you have, and that's to look internally as opposed to look externally. What caused me to feel this way? Um, we have met the enemy, and they is us. We did this all on our own. Thank you very much. There's nobody out there pushing buttons, making us feel the way that we feel. So if you start to get a little bit of muscle, with that being, your friend, like, okay, I do have some things that I want to see manifest in the world, and I'm willing to put myself out there for them. And it's not necessarily always going to be comfortable. And in fact, I think the opposite is mostly true. If it's worthwhile and you say, I'm going to do this, it sure seems like the universe is saying, oh, no, you don't. Or let me just see about that. So the whole notion of the past and the future helps to get into the area of, why am I feeling the way that I am? A good question, but a better question is, what do I do with this feeling that I'm having right now with regard to what I'd like to see happen in the world? I've always felt like getting an answer to the word why is like a fool's errand. You'll come up with an answer, and now you're satisfied with that, and there's no difference in the world. But if you can take that and you can put it into a better question, Ken, that you and I have been talking about for years and years and years, that better question leads you to an opportunity to gain some more experience, have a reaction, make some decisions, reflect on it, and then come up with a better question. So, in terms of that sort of a logic loop or a learning loop or an experience loop, the neat part about the future and the past is to sit down and start to make some decisions for yourself. Like, let's try this and see how this goes. It seems like, to me, any lesson that I have never gotten, it just keeps presenting itself over and over and over and over until I beat that bad boy. And more often than not, the beating of the bad boy is to ignore it and move on anyway.
So Dan Pink wrote a book called Drive, it's kind of, it's a lot of it's about like motivation, but he uses one metaphor I always found interesting. He talks about the elephant and the rider, and the fact that, you've got the rider is our awareness, our intellect, our consciousness. The elephant is our nervous system, our emotional state, those reactions you're talking about. And the fact that no one makes an elephant do anything. you can guide it and hope, but you can't force that elephant to go the way you want it to go. So, and it's interesting because, like, you talk about, I remember early on that feeling of disappointment or embarrassment when I would have a bad class. But over years, through experience and resetting the way my mind views and interprets what is a good or bad class. Now, generally, I don't experience disappointment. I experience excitement, because when the class doesn't go well, that's like really interesting feedback that's going to lead to new opportunities for me to become a better teacher or create a better learning environment, because something's changed or something unexpected happened, and I'm in a place of curiosity. So I don't have the same identity set point. I am not the class. The class is the class, and it's an interesting thing. So I think that one of the things we forget is emotions can be a symptom of the way we choose to frame the experiences of our life, you know and I can remember my mentor really taught me this through example. It would, whenever you said something that you had some kind of an emotional attachment, his emotional response never matched what you thought a person would have when you shared that news with him, because he
Right.
had a completely different way that he had framed his view of the world and his understanding of the role that he could play in it. So, and it was all intentional. It was cultivated through years. It was masterful, something I'm still aspiring to. But so it's like, you know we see this with kids. They have an emotional response to a loss, or something didn't go the way they wanted. You can't change the elephant, but what you can do is you can start to shift their relationship to that experience, and how much they associate their identity to it. We did this with this Go Beyond the Grades program we did. They found that a lot of students were over associating their personal identity with the letter grade. I got an A, therefore I'm a good person. I got an F, therefore I'm a bad person, that kind of thing.
Or I
Instead of
got
the
a
test being the
therefore I'm a
test,
bad
right?
person.
Yeah, it added a lot of stress. So, but if you can, remove some of that identity, all right, you had a successful experience, and and you received that A, so what do you learn from that? Or you had a less successful experience and you received an F, what do you learn from that? It's not you, it's about the process of you being you,
So
Well,
I'd like to just respond to that because I have a thought about it. And what you're pointing to is that our culture teaches us that things are dichotomies. You're going to either get some of this or you're going to get some of this. This being success, this being failure. But if we sat our kids down and we said, look, this is how life works. You can either do something or you can do nothing. So if you do something, now let's start with if you do nothing. If you do nothing, then something's going to happen or nothing's going to happen.
and the,
And
and the nothing is still something.
100%. So the other part of it is if you do something, then either something's going to happen or nothing's going to happen. I want you to notice that your action or inaction makes little difference to success and failure. The success and failure is 100% existing only in your mind. So if you will consider that you will do nothing and something will happen or nothing will happen, actually occurs like many things may happen or many things may not happen. And if you do something, many things may happen or many things may not happen. That what you're going for in your life through your actions and inactions properly timed is to get outcomes, an array of outcomes that are both moving you in the general direction of completing something that you think is valuable and worth your time and effort, or revealing to you that your effort in that particular area is not going to take you where you want to go, so you can make other choices from the other outcomes. So if you look at life not like I won and I lost, but what lesson is here no matter what comes out of it, and you begin with that outcome in mind, and you're willing for whatever happens to happen in all cases, then you can take that and you can laugh, you can have some fun, you can try it again and see if you can duplicate it. You just have so many different ways that you can go that are not disempowering.
So two things came to mind as you guys were talking. So one is my favorite classes to teach are actually when people come to me with certain certain things that they want to work on. So that's like I had a kind of student who came to me the other day and said to me, the outside of the heel of my hand is killing me. And I'm sitting there and she's like, and I know it's arthritis. Well, I did a whole class around wrists and hands and how you hold your weight in your hands. And actually, I got through class and I thought to myself, well, that's really cool because my wrists don't hurt. And I know I have issues in the base of my thumb. And it was just like, so that's my favorite kind of class to design because I can sit there and say, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. And this is what parts of the body we're going to work to help this, and with the intention that then they can take some of those hopefully and maybe incorporate them into their daily routine, and that helps relieve some sort of discomfort that they had. But one of the things that Ken was talking about with kids who identify either with like, oh my gosh, like all my worth is based on quote unquote this, the fact that I did this poorly or I did this well, is how much people actually spend and how we label ourselves according to a certain thing that we do, or like I'm a yoga teacher and I place my whole identity or on that. And then if I no longer am a yoga teacher, who have I become?
Right.
And so that's what it reminded me of when you were saying that those patterns don't change as we get older. We identify with certain aspects of ourselves or our life. We're a wife, we're a child, we're, whatever we do for a living. And all of a
Mhm.
sudden, when those go away, we feel lost. And so it's really becoming comfortable with your identity outside of all of that. Like if all that were to go away, who are you?
Yeah. So, in response to what you just said, which I think is very cool because we often do operate like there's a beginning to the next thing that we're going to do, and then there's a post, ex facto review of how it went. Okay. But what's really cool is if you can be in the middle of how it's going and take information from what's happening right now and make adjustments as a result of what's real time. So, for example, I'll go back to a breakthrough that I had in high school. And I got this from another student. And what she told me was um, she had straight A's all through high school. And she said, first of all, I study so hard. My intent is to know everything cold that's going to be on the exams. And I said, okay, that's really great. And she said, and I want to know it well enough that I come up to a question that I do not know the answer to. And I know that's something I either need to spend more time learning about, or I know with what I do know that I can come up with one or two answers that would be most likely. And she said, and that gets me usually into the it's not like I read the question and I don't know the answer and then I give up on it. No, I use the training that I did ahead of time on the court to make a decision about, do I pass to an A or do I pass to a C in terms of an answer? And I do it based on elimination. And so I thought to myself, that's kind of really cool. And she said, I said, mostly when you get your exams back, you kind of know what your score was going to be before you get it back. And she said, always. She says it comes down to two or three questions on an entire exam where there's even any doubt. The rest of them, I know them cold. And I thought to myself, all right, so there's some memorization going on here, but then there's also some in the moment, real time logic and decision making. And so I started using that concept with regard to other things going on in my life. Like, how do you get promoted? It has nothing to do with making your superior like you. Turns out it has everything to do with really becoming good at the assignments that they've given you and learning everything that you can about what they do so you can help them get their jobs done as well, and do it quietly and silently and just always be there as someone that's dependable. So that kind of carries through to a lot of different things. And so what I'm coming at here is there's not like you get prepared, you do the thing, and then after it's over, it is what it is. And, now I failed or I won. It's more like, in terms of mastery, what did I learn about myself while doing this? Where is it in my process that I need a step or two more, or another, set of conditions that I can come up with in advance? And while you're doing it, right?
I think that sounds good. And I'm not saying that you don't do that or people don't do that, but I think when you have some sort of emotional connection, a deeper emotional connection. So something like being a parent, where you're responsible for another being and there's this strong, strong emotional tie. I think that gets to be where errors get to be more than about you, like it could be the well-being of a child or a parent. Then I think it gets complicated. Well, it tends to be a little bit more. I don't know, it just seems to be deeper than some sort of element, because that's like something that really ties into the heart and love. So I think the more connected emotionally we have to a circumstance or to a situation, the more emotional investment, let's say, the more like it can be more complicated. And
Well, see that.
it's not as easy to say, okay, well, I failed this time. Like
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, Jan. And it's an indication that the training level is not sufficient for you to be calm enough and collected enough to take all those emotional feelings and put them, to work as the energy for getting an outcome, staying with it until it's over. And what I found mostly, I would say, in my lifetime, in certain family sort of things, women, in my experience, my sisters, my mothers, my aunts, in times of just plain chaos, when something was really going bad with one of their kids, they always did much better than my uncles and my brothers and I did. And the reason for that is they were with the children a heck of a lot more time than we were, and they could tell if there was really something serious here, or not. And Jan, I can tell you, when I was a kid, something happened to one of my siblings, I had to take my sister Laura to the doctor's office because she had a fishing lure stuck through her earlobe, right? Because my brother was casting and it caught her in the earlobe. And I'm about to pass out the whole way over. I could do any kind of pain for myself, but just seeing that little bit of blood, and, nothing I could do for her, right? Now, if I'd have been thinking at home, I would have just gone downstairs and I would have got some pliers, and I would have broken the hook, and then I would have put some mercurochrome on it and a Band-Aid, and we'd have been done. But I took her to the doctor's office.
Well, I'm not saying that was a bad move, Bill, because personally, I think you probably should have. But
It was the best I could do on short notice with the training that I had to that date.
that's right. But I think there is something to say that when you have such an emotional investment in something, that that whole idea of that, I want to say, it's sort of like the observer view of taking a look from the outside and saying, okay, this is what happened, becomes somewhat more challenging to incorporate.
Completely agree with you.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what I'm trying to say is that for people at different skill levels, that goes away at a different point in the process, where you reach that door where your previous experience and training, how to keep yourself in check while you're in a very dangerous situation. Which is why, if you have, you know uh, different types of trained infantrymen, if they get tossed into a situation that's uncomfortable for them, they're going to either live or they're going to die. But if you get somebody who's trained at the level of a uh, Red Beret, or a Navy SEAL or something of that nature, their training is 100% about getting themselves and their buddies out alive. Completely different, different level of what you're talking about. And you see that also, with in medical situations, people that are in interns versus doctors, doctors that have been doing it for 15 or 20 years. You can bring anything through that door in that situation, and that doctor is going to have a reaction, and that reaction is going to stay in the background until it's all over. whereas somebody else may get flustered and not know what to do in the moment. I completely agree with you. And I'm wondering if that's not useful for the folks that are listening right now and beneficial to them in terms of where does this happen to you, in your life?
Well, it's interesting because I was having this conversation with somebody about some sort of program that I'm developing with someone about overcoming grief after the loss of a pet. And so we got into this conversation about veterinarians and how a lot of the veterinarians that I know have a disconnect. It's like they have just, there's this almost like some sort of protective element, which kind of allows them to do what they do without becoming so attached. Because otherwise, if you had, you know, in my bot, I mean, veterinarians do have the highest suicide rate, but
Hmm.
right now. So, but it's like that of constantly being around the responsibility of, let's say, euthanizing animals and what that does, and how do you do that on a daily basis and go on. And I think it's like that with a lot of different professions. I mean, I've had conversations with surgeons who basically look at the body as like that part or the area that they do surgery on, and they kind of disconnect from the other part of it.
Right.
And how much of that is really, it's like you said, is this expertise, but also this kind of emotional protection for yourself, because if yeah, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do what you did. I read a really interesting article many years ago in Yoga Journal about this doctor who was a surgeon, and actually one of his patients said he should go for yoga, and because he was having a lot of anxiety and stress management issues. And he said he started to go, and then afterwards, for the first time in his life, afterwards, after he started practicing, he would go in and go to do surgery, and he all of a sudden realized what he was doing. Like, he looked at them as people and whole people as opposed to this one body part. And he said he had a really hard time in the beginning. He would be crying in his mask because
Yeah.
all of a sudden he realized what he was doing. And that's what I'm talking about, is like, I think people in general, we develop an armor because emotionally we can only handle so much, and then we're like, okay, I can't handle anymore. Like, that's it, and I'm done, until I kind of just sit back and kind of sit with it, maybe, or process it to some extent, and then move forward. But there is an idea of kind of
I
taking your own.
wonder, I wonder about how much of this is a cultivating of capacity, and like one of the things in Zen training, you learn to kind of hold paradoxical things that are both true at the same time. So like, what is heavy weightlessness? You can experience that, but that doesn't make sense, you know, but you can experience it. What's nostalgia? It's happy sadness. It's like conflicting, but we can hold it. So, the identity piece, you don't have to stop being a parent because your children are grown and left the house, or your children died. I mean, you can still hold onto that piece, both and. It doesn't have to be binary. So you can be the student capable of acing a test and flunking a test simultaneously. Those things can both be true, and you can have two conflicting emotional reactions simultaneously, but I think, that can be challenging because it's what I found was holding paradoxical things required a strengthening of the capacity to do so. So, and I find it a lot. It was interesting, like as an athlete, some coaches will look at your skill set and say, don't do it that way anymore. And so now you're placed in this position of feeling like, oh no, I have to unlearn something and then replace it with this. And my martial arts teacher would always say, it's adding another tool to your toolbox. He never asked me to let something go. Some things would just dissolve because they became unnecessary, but it was never like that's wrong, this is right. It's add this in and then test it and see what works. But you can hold them both simultaneously, even if it's conflicting in the way they're expressing or your understanding of it. So it's this both and approach. And and I think about even like, so a veterinarian, if they're seeing the Tao of life and suffering and joy and the dance that those things do, would that give them, would that strengthen their capacity to hold the grief, that's going to come and go, along with the joy and the excitement of someone coming in with that new puppy for their first set of shots, like, so it's interesting.
Absolutely. And so, um, my friend Elizabeth and I, who are doing this, we got into this whole conversation, and we're now investigating is what kind of programs do vet schools offer for vets, like, as far as education goes, or maybe doing something like that, like strengthening that kind of capacity to hold both um, during training, because I don't know that they get any right now. So I think they go into a field and aren't, most of them have sort of apprenticed or worked through vet school. So they get some minimal, like they get some exposure throughout training. But I'm like, how much is that cultivated and during their training, so that they go in when they open up their practice or they go into practice with tools to handle what they're going to encounter. So, I think I look at myself, and, I worked in, um, when I worked for the city, the New York City Department of Health, I had a very, very high stress, very high level security job. And it was at that point where I learned that I said, some people are meant to be a fireman, like, kind of thing. And I thought, well, that's not me. And I wasn't prepared emotionally for what I was doing. It really sort of wore on my soul. So I left, and I probably could have cultivated it, but it wasn't something I decided to pursue after a certain number of years. But I think that, could we offer something like that, or could I offer something like that? It was where I was going. It's like, could I help people live in both spaces, like, don't feel, and I think that some of it is also this feeling of people have to be willing, and to some extent, to sit with those really hard emotions, which a lot of people don't really want to do. They don't want to be in that uncomfortable space. We're
Yeah.
used, we're very used to, like, trying to get out of anything uncomfortable, especially in the West. It's kind of like, well, I don't like this. This doesn't feel good. What else
Yep.
can I do? What else can
That,
I do to distract
that's
myself?
a really good point. Yeah, Seth Godin did a blog about, he was talking about kids and saying how they don't know how to sit with being bored, because they have access to something to fill every second of, so they just don't know how to just sit there and not be stimulated. Like, it's, and it's just the nature of our environment right now. They have the capacity to do it. They just, they have, most, first world kids have the resources to where they don't need to do that. Whereas, you hear people saying, well, when I was a kid, I'd sit in my room and just, I could play with a rock for hours and just blah 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 blah. It's like, yeah, well, that's because that was the only choice you had. So you tapped into a part of yourself and you cultivated it, you strengthened it. So, and I guarantee you, I've been working with kids for years. You stick them in a room, they're going to be very uncomfortable. But if they have no choice, they'll stop being bored. They will find a way to tap into the part of them. But it's just unnecessary when your environment is providing you substitutes for that. So yeah, so it's really interesting if you think about it. What you're really having a conversation about is we have access to certain tools that are holding us in certain patterns that either force us to grow our capacity or don't. And it's probably not intentional. And the other thing that's very interesting about that, and I've gone through this a few times recently, when someone's in pain, whether it's physical or emotional, they're experiencing grief, there's this urge to make them feel better, instead of holding space for them to actually experience that pain. And it's very uncomfortable. I'm going through it with my parents right now. And, when my mom's crying and she's scared and she's in pain, and I'm just gently being present, my siblings can struggle with that. And they want to do something about it. They want to take some kind of action or go yell at a doctor, or, that, so you're right. How comfortable are you with being uncomfortable? And yeah.
and I think it is a huge lesson for our like our capacity as humans to want to alleviate pain, or
Mm.
even any beings, because Tonka comes up to me when I'm upset, so I don't think it's limited to humans, but
Yeah, yeah.
capacity to want to help. And so I had a client who very suddenly lost her daughter, like a little bit, probably about 11 months ago, and being with her almost on a weekly basis and just having to hold space, and and watching the whole grief process, which I've been through grief myself and had people in my life, but maybe because I was basically there the entire time, every a scheduled time every week. So interesting how, as people, especially grief, people like have these things of like, you're not through this yet, or like that grief has a timeline, you know. And I'm like, there is no timeline. It's like you go through it as you go through it. And so it's just been a very interesting process. But I think as people, I think one is we don't want to feel that uncomfortableness ourselves, and we don't want other people, and sometimes having other people in our life feel uncomfortable is even worse than when we feel uncomfortable.
Like when your sister gets a fish hook in her ear,
That's right. Exactly. Exactly.
So, this is a rich conversation, and I really honor everything that you are both saying. And what's at stake here, it's big. Jan, with regard to veterinarians being at risk for suicide, and Ken, when you're bringing up, the both and, like most people will get a both. It's either this or this, and then that gives them certain limited outcomes that are possible. But in that moment, if they can look for the and develop the and generate the and see what's going on here. So for instance, it's like the more intelligent and the more work somebody has done to become skilled at their craft, they believe that they become better predictors of the future. And so you get folks that will say, while they're on that path, before they get to be really good at it, they will say, when I do this, then this is what happens. Right. But if you really take a look at it, it will if it does, it will if it does. You got no, there's not a damn thing you can do about it. You do what you do, then something happens, and you're going to take credit for it either working or not working. That's going to give you a very small set of outcomes and possibilities for your own life in terms of, am I doing something of value? Do I make a difference? So the ands will be to allow for, I'm going to do something, and it's going to happen if it happens. And then whatever happens, I've got what it takes to respond to that in a powerful way and make a difference. And so it's kind of like, you can come into a situation, and I'll use poker as kind of like the metaphor. There are people that get to be pretty good, and they think they can put somebody else on a hand. They're playing a pair of jacks, or they've got ace king or something like that. And the experts, the ones that win the most money over time, go, in this situation, I can put you on a range. You might possibly have anything from a pair of sevens all the way up to, ace king, ace jack, ace queen. And there's 11 different hands that I can say that range would fit how you're playing the hand right now. So that's predicting outcomes as a range, and as the and portion of it. So both and the and is the powerful part for people to get trained in. Do not look for this happening or not happening. Let's do something, get a result, and then respond from there and learn from it, and then increase your ability to be powerful in that moment if it's really unexpected. You know, and anybody that's been through bankruptcy, there's two ways you can do that. You can put your head between your legs and kiss your ass goodbye, or you can say, how do I play this game? What's in it for me if I get really good at figuring out how this works before I have to make key decisions? So I'm saying to you, when there's everything at stake, it's really hard not to just trust somebody else with the outcome or trust somebody else with the result. And I would think that anybody who is so tied to the results that they would take their own life over it, has to get some help in the area of, you know, as many times as it works out and you do save an animal, there are going to be these times. And if you can't handle that, you probably ought to be doing something else, because the outcome of you ending your own life is not worth it.
And I
That's my.
think yeah, no, I was just going to say, and I think some of it, is no matter, I think part of it is the downfall of our education system and the fact that people label themselves as being proficient at something if they have a degree. And
Yeah.
I don't think, I'm not saying that that's not true, but what ends up happening is I think that there's something to be said for on the job training, even with that expertise.
Yeah.
So I think there's so much that practical life experience, which you cannot learn in a classroom because you haven't been in with people or people, real life scenarios, and so much of that has to come from just being, I always say, I was in certain circumstances. I remember that when I was working in a lab at Cornell, I remember one of my colleagues who trained me. And so there I am, I'm on the job for like an hour and a half, like a few weeks or like a month or something. And she was pregnant and she went into preterm labor. So there she is, and all of a sudden I'm doing everything. And I had learned it and I had done it with her, but I hadn't done it on my own. And all of a sudden I was like, okay. And there I am, it's 11 p.m. and I'm still at the lab. And my mother calls and she's like, well, just go home. And I'm like, Ma, you don't understand. I just can't leave. I just can't leave. And let me tell you, there's a lot to be said by learning by what we call like learning by fire. Like all of a sudden you're thrown in and you're like, okay, I guess I better learn this. And if I'm not sure, I repeat it because I want it to be right. And then there is nothing like learning that in that way.
Yeah.
The time. I mean, we plan in our heads and we think, okay, if this happens and this happens, but you know, we can't. You can't take into account. We can prepare as much as we can prepare, and then
Yeah.
you've got to just say, okay.
You know that parable of the master and the young student, where the young student asks the master, "What is wisdom?" And the master indicates, "Well, wisdom is actually good judgment." And okay, master, and where does good judgment come from? From experience. And where does experience come from? Almost indelibly from and unavoidably from bad judgment. So you have to be in action. You have to do something. You have to always and everywhere be willing to take the risk, get the outcome, learn from it, and then move on. So, with that said, any final thoughts on this today? We've had another extraordinary conversation, which I feel horrible saying, we do need to bring it to an end, but we can probably do something again later on. Um, Last thoughts.
I had a formula that just popped into it has to do with past and future, and it was something my mentor shared with me, and I had heard they were interviewing the Dalai Lama, and someone asked him, "Are you enlightened?" And he looked and kind of smiled and said, "Not at the moment." And I loved that, So we were talking about it, and then so John kind of went on this whole what's enlightenment, and he had this kind of these five um, frameworks that we operate under that we flex in and out of. And it had to do with the ratio of time. He was a mathematician. So he's like, if 20% of your time is spent in the present and the rest is somehow past and future, you're in kind of a victim framework. Things are happening to you. You're worried about the future. You're frustrated with what happened in the past. He says if you shift that a little bit to where you're more like 30-40% present, now you're in what he called manifester. You're in control. You can make things happen. You're in control of your own life. And he said when you reach a 50-50 balance, 50% present moment and the 50% past and future, he said he called that we consciousness. You've recognized it's not happening to you. It's not you making it happen. You're part of a larger picture. So you're not isolated. There's just, there's this kind of dance going on, right? And he said enlightenment is when you hit like 70-75%, very, very little bit of time, relatively focusing on past and future, more present moment. But then what was really interesting to me is he said there's a 90% place, and he called that liberation. And it's like when you're freed of those feelings of attachment, you're freed from being influenced by those emotions. And it's not that the bad things or what people might consider bad things don't come and go, but you're 90% of the time you can just stay present and aware and accepting of those things with grace and balance. And he said, but you still have the 5% on either side because that's what keeps us human and humble. So I just thought that was like a really interesting way of viewing it that I had never heard before, that, really framed it around that idea of past, present, future.
Excellent.
In yoga, we call that the dance. A lot of times people will say lila, and lila is play. So it's play of like the flow, the play between, you might say, dark and light, between creation and dissolution.
Yeah.
It's lila, it's play.
I like that. Yeah, it's funny. We used to have one of our teacher training practice, like one of the points we would have was implementation. And years ago, I changed it from implementation to practice and play, so that the relationship you had with it was more like that dance. But I like that word even better. That's fun.
And so, yeah, so it is fun. But the way you reframed it sounds a lot better than implement.
Yeah. Yeah, well, implement, I was in that businessy, hustle, grind, go, make it happen, this try harder mindset. And, and that was stressful. It puts a lot of pressure on you. So it's like, you know what? It's just, let's test it. Let's practice. Let's play with it. And, you can still work hard. There can be effort,
Right.
but now you're not putting quite as much pressure on yourself and everyone around you.
Well, and I think that's where, this can be another week because I think we can go forever. But that's, I think, the difference for sometimes when you feel passionate about something, because I think then there can be effort and there can be that kind of play. But if there's dispassion or no passion for what you do, I think that's, if it's a job, there's got to be a way to bring joy into it, I guess.
Yeah.
Is what I'm thinking.
Yep.
With all that said, it's absolutely perfect. And give yourself a little bit of room to have more passion and more joy and more present. And with that in mind, there's an epidemic of people feeling disconnected and alone. So will you all please reach out to 30 people by the end of the year by email, text, and phone call? Just let them know that you appreciate them and you're thinking about them, and help us spread the word that there's always someone you can turn to. Let's see if we can save a few veterinarians by the end of the month, and others, okay? So with that said, we are right. Who are we again? We're lighting the candle, a world that works. And quite frankly, it's been another extraordinary episode. And thank you both, Ken and Jan, for your contribution and energy. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at xvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.